If n is a positive integer, is n cubed minus n divisible by 4? Statement number 1 tells us that n equals 2k plus 1, where k is an integer. Well, this is interesting. If k is an integer, 2 times k would have to be an even integer. And then if we take an even integer and add 1, we get an odd integer. So 2k plus 1, that's actual general algebraic form for an odd number. So we know that n is odd. But let's try some examples. We want to compare odd values of n and see what happens when we evaluate n cubed minus n. So if n equals 1, 1 cubed minus 1 is 0. That's divisible by 4. If n is 3, 3 cubed 27 minus 3 is 24. That's divisible by 4. If we plug in 5, we get 125 minus 5 is 120. That's divisible by 4. Even if we plug in negatives, negative 3, we'd get negative 27 minus negative 3, which would be negative 24. So it looks like no matter what odd number we plug in, n cubed minus n is divisible by 4. And again, the GMAT is not going to give you something where the pattern works for all the simple numbers that you plug in and then the pattern breaks down for some larger numbers. That does happen a lot of times in advanced abstract mathematics, but it's not going to happen with the math they give you on the GMAT. So here we have a pattern that works, and it looks like knowing that odd is sufficient to answer the question. So statement number 1 is sufficient. Statement number 2 tells us that n squared plus n is divisible by 6. Well, that's interesting. What kind of values of n would make it divisible by 6? Well, certainly if n equals 3, well then 3 squared plus 3, that's 9 plus 3 is 12. That's divisible by 6. And we found out already from statement number 1 that 3 is something that works. In other words, when n equals 3, n cubed minus n is divisible by 4. Another value that would produce something divisible by 3 is n equals 2, because of course 2 squared plus 2 equals 6, and of course 6 is divisible by 6. Well, what happens if we plug 2 into n cubed minus n? Well, then we get 8 minus 2, which is 6, which is not divisible by 4. So in other words, if we know that n squared plus n is divisible by 6, we can pick some values which work and other values which don't work. And so that means that this statement by itself, n squared plus n is divisible by 6, is not sufficient to allow us to determine a unique answer to the question. It leaves open ambiguity. So this statement is insufficient. Statement number 1 is sufficient. Statement number 2 is insufficient. Answer choice A.